In this lesson, we'll take a look at another feature of dbt called snapshots. And snapshots are a way to track your source data like a slowly changing dimension. And if you're not familiar with that, slowly changing dimensions allow you to keep track of all historical changes to a specific record. And we'll talk about this a little bit more in the example. And so in this section of using snapshots, we're going to review the goal of snapshots in dbt. We're going to populate a new source table. We'll build a snapshot table, and then we're going to reference it in a staging model and see how you might use this. If we take a look at the documentation, again, what are snapshots? The goal here is to be able to look back in time at previous states of some sort of data. And sometimes you're able to do this with the source system itself, but sometimes it's not. So dbt allows this possibility through their own features. Here's a nice example. Let's say in this scenario, you have an ID where the status is pending, and then later on it moves from pending to shipped. How do you keep track of both of those? Do you override it? But sometimes you want to be able to see both of those, and more importantly, when that change happened. And with snapshots, it's going to create a table that looks like this based on this example, and it's going to pre-fill the certain data points based on certain columns and information that you provide. And it'll be able to tell when it was valid from, when it changed, and if it's the most active one, it'll stay null here, and you'll have access to both of them. And we'll be able to configure this within the snapshots directory, which is something we haven't used yet. And it will be a SQL file, but with the snapshot qualifier here, and within it with a couple configs, which we'll talk about as we go through. So as usual, the best way to learn is to see it in action. So let's go through the steps of making this possible. First things first, let's go to our Snowflake environment, and we're going to add data to this other table that we built in the previous video, which is ads. And we're going to insert some data here. So if you go to your project files, you should see a query that looks something like this. If you haven't created the table, here it is. Go ahead and copy all three of these inserts. We're going to do one at a time, but just copy all three so you don't have to go back and give yourself some space. First of all, we need to update the number, and now insert this data into the ads table. And we'll do a select star from this table. And if we take a look, we should see, here it is, updated on this date. It's just a date, it's not a date time. Some statuses, an objective, and just a couple ads that are being used. While we're at it, I'm going to go through and update the rest of these. Now in this scenario, what we're saying is we understand that this information could change. For example, later on, we're going to change this from active to inactive, and we're going to change this from sales to awareness. How do we keep track of those changes? Well, we're going to create a snapshot table, and we're going to do it through dbt. So let's go into our project. Here we have the project open, and I'm going to hide some of these objects here. And what we'll do now is, for the first time, go over to our snapshots directory. And within here, we can create a new file. And this is going to be where our snapshot is held. In this case, I'll call it add snapshots.sql. But more importantly, within here is where we're going to create the code for that snapshot. And if you remember here, it's going to have this condition right here, which is kind of like a macro or a test or a doc. All of these follow a similar Jinja look with the bracket and percentage signs. So what we'll do here is start off with snapshot, and then we want to give it a name. In this case, we can call it ads snapshot. Maybe we want to keep this consistent here. Add snapshot. This is going to finish, again, similar to the others, end snapshot. All right, so now everything within here is where we will create the logic to build a table that looks like this for us. Let's start with just the select statement. So what we want is to select star from a source. And it mentions in here, and I have found this to be true, that best practices when using snapshot is to snapshot source data. And ultimately what's going to happen here is we're going to treat this then as our source in our staging models. So you build the snapshot on top of a source, and then the snapshot is used in the staging model. So we're going to use this source function here for that reason. Also, include as many columns as possible. In fact, go for a select star. We want to be able to use this just like a source, and we can't go back and recreate all the columns later. So we might as well grab them all now just to keep it, assuming it's not a huge issue performance-wise. We also want to avoid joins and limit the amount of transformation. Just think of this like a replacement for your source itself, you wouldn't be doing that except for in the staging layer. So treat it the same way. So in this case, what we're going to do is if we go to staging, if we go to our sources, we're going to take this ads source, and the name of our source is ad platform. So ad platform ads. That's our source. Next, what we need to do is configure the settings here for the snapshot model. Now we can go through this one at a time. We'll create 2 squiggly brackets and a config block for our model. And in this case, instead of a model, it's actually a snapshot. All right, so we'll follow what we have here. Target schema. You could also put a target database here. So if we scroll up a little bit, we can see, here we go, target database. In this case, we're not going to be changing the database. We'll keep it in the same spot. So we can just leave that go and just move on to schema. And in this case, we'll create a separate schema called snapshots. And that's actually another good practice because you want to keep these separate. These are something that should be treated separately from other objects. So just to be safe, it's good practice to keep them in a separate schema. Just keep them away from everything else so they don't get confused. They don't get mixed up with things that you don't want them to be. So target schema, snapshots will help us make sure that happens. Next is unique key. In our case, the unique ID is going to be add ID, and that's because we want each of these to be updated accordingly. Even though this is the primary key of the table itself, so there's going to be a unique record for each row, the unique identifier of a concept in this row of the granularity is add ID. So that is why we would do add ID here. Next is strategy, and there are 2 main ways that you go about this. There's the timestamp strategy, which is recommended, which would be if you have a date or a timestamp column. In our case, it's just a date, it'll work, but preferably a timestamp column to indicate when the last record, the last row was updated. So example, updated at. That's the best way to do this and the recommended approach. Alternatively, you can do what's called the check strategy, which is if you don't have a reliable updated at column, it's going to compile a list of columns between their current and historical values. And between those, you should be able to identify a unique row or a unique concept within the table and use that as a way of keeping things in check. For example, down here, maybe the combination of these two gives you a unique value and it can detect changes from that. You can also say check calls all, but it's better to explicitly determine those columns just to be safe, or use a surrogate key to condense how many columns. There's different ways to do this, but I just want to point out that those are the 2 strategies. All right, so for us, strategy will be timestamp and updated at the actual column name called updated at here. So it will match exactly. And again, if you had the check strategy, you would do it this way instead of the updated at field like we're doing here. So with that said, now we have our data inserted. We can see it's here. Let's create this snapshot table through dbt. And to do that, what we'll do is the command dbt snapshot. And what that's going to do is look within your project, within the snapshots folder, look for anything with a snapshot flag here and do its thing. dbt deps first. dbt snapshot. Okay, so we got our hooks running for our audit, and it finished running the snapshot. We can see snapshotted this one in particular. So let's refresh here, and we should have a new schema right here called snapshots, which is keeping our snapshots here for us. And we can see these dbt columns were added for us. Let's do a select star from this table to see it. You can see it created the name for it based on what we called it here. And we can see now everything is updated. So the first time you run it, everything gets updated as is. And we can see exactly when dbt updated it, when it's valid from, and if anything changed. In our case, nothing did. It gives it a unique hash value. Now let's add another data point. And what it's going to do is be a new version of an existing record. So if we run this insert, even though it's a new ID for the table, it's a new version of the same ad ID, which we're saying should be unique. So right now, even though it's in the ads table, we don't have it in our snapshot table. But let's now run the snapshot command once again. And what we would expect to happen here is we have a historical record of both of them within our source. But again, imagine that maybe that was overwritten instead of just added as a new value. Now if we go to this, now we can see DBT value 2. It invalidated it here and replaced it with the new one. And we have both, and we can see it has now both versions of that record. Now let's add the other value here. So let's insert this last record. And if we take a look at the raw table now, we should have 5 records. And this one will update the sales to awareness. But if we look at snapshot, that should not be there. And we can see there's only 1 record for 2, but let's run DBT snapshot once again and review what we got. And it should be similar as before. So now we have 2 different records that are invalidated or that are old. And what we can do is look where DBT valid from is null, which would give us, or I'm sorry, where valid 2 is null, which would give us the most recent versions of each record. And there we have it. And we can see all the old ones that have been updated by just running a command like this. So it keeps track of your data as a snapshot in time through a fairly straightforward feature of DBT. And normally this is something that takes a lot of engineering just to get right. There's a lot of custom code, but they make it pretty simple out of the box to do it like this. Now, the last step here is how would we actually use this? What's the whole point? Well, like we said, we're going to use this kind of as a replacement for the sources. So what we'll do is create a new staging model here, and I'll call this stage ad platform. We'll keep with the naming convention ads.sql. And I have code here. It's within the course documents. You can just copy and paste it. We're going to use a ref just like we would with another model or a seed, but this time it's refing the snapshot. So this will work. And I've selected all of the columns, including the different updated valid at 2. And maybe you want to keep those in your staging model, but I'm going to trim those out. Really, that's up to you. I just want to show how you could do that. And what we can do is a DBT run, select stage ad platform ads. And this should pick up the snapshot, run this, create this as a view, and deploy it as a staging model. All right, so let's go now, refresh, check out our views, and here it is. Now we can take a look, and there's that record for us based on the snapshot. You can keep all of the columns, you can trim it down if you want, but behind the scenes, you have this constantly updating and historical log of your source data through a built-in feature of DBT. And you can do this for as many sources as you want. So there's a lot of different ways you could use this, but hopefully now you have a good understanding of what snapshots are, how to add them, and then how you would use them to build out your project and keep track of all of your historical records.